Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And today we are going down under to talk about Australia's new social media law. Is it actually going to work? And I have a lot of thoughts on this, but first, we're going to discuss what the law does, and then we're going to look at the pros and the cons. We're going to look at possible longitudinal outcomes of this, and obviously my thoughts along the way. But let's start with the key features based on the Online Safety Amendment Social Media Minimum Age Law. Basically, it's the act that started in 2024. And essentially, here's what's going on. Because from basically December 10th of this year, major social platforms, think like Meta and all of its apps, TikTok, YouTube, Snapchat, Reddit, Twitch, X, Kick, and some of the others must take quote unquote reasonable steps to stop under 16s basically from having accounts. Now, it's framed as a delay to having an account and not actually a crime for kids. And there's no penalty for under 16s or their parents, only for the platforms, and fines reach up to $49.5 million Australian per breach, which is roughly 38,000 US. So enforcement is via the eSafety Commissioner of Australia, with age verification, age assurance guidance such as face or AI check estimation, ID checks, probabilistic methods, all of that being enforced on these platforms. Browsing without an account is still generally allowed. The ban is only really for account-based social features. We all know that if we just generically browse YouTube, it doesn't have our algorithm where it's feeding us our preferences. If the only thing you watch is cartoons all day, you're going to get more cartoons. If you watch politics, you're going to get more politics. Generic doesn't know that. Now, there's already, for the record, a high court challenge in Australia arguing that this law violates the implied freedom of political communication. And we're going to talk about that. But let's start with the pros here, because if the evidence is right that heavy social media use contributes to anxiety, depression, self-harm, especially for girls, a delayed start could reduce cumulative exposure during a sensitive development window in a child's life. And I do believe that is correct. If you go read basically anything from Jonathan Haidt, the longitudinal studies are in iGen by Jean Twenge basically proved it, but we now have a lot of correlation and causation on this. And so, yeah, I do believe that that is indeed the case, and studies show that 16 is the bare minimum. I think 19 is better, but, we'll start here, right? And so that essentially is the government's logic. This is how they're actually framing that. It's mental health, it's body image, it's bullying, it's addictive design of these social media platforms. And we know they're designed to addict us. So longitudinally, if we see lower rates of certain harms, like in the first group of kids that are now growing up in Australia under this law, so think about things like self-harm, eating disorders, cyberbullying, if that starts to decrease or improve in that generation, we've got a really solid argument for similar policies around the world, because quite frankly, Australia will have just proved it for everybody. Now, a major pro is that today, the default MO here has been that these platforms design these super addictive systems, and then parents are simply just told to monitor screen time, right? They're putting it on the parents. So shifting this legal risk to these platforms forces the platforms to build in safeguards like age checks, safety defaults, all of that stuff, rather than expecting families to do it themselves. Or simply not, because a lot of people aren't tech savvy, or they don't really read about these kinds of things, and so they just give the kid the phone, and here we go. I recently just read a study about 2-year-olds getting onto YouTube, because the parents hand them the phone, all this kind of stuff. And so I think that the best case scenario here in 10 to 15 years out is that we might see a global norm that children's services are separate products with strict duty of care requirements. And I'm going to talk about this a bit further in a minute here as well. Now, that's all of the concrete, especially when we're talking about the pros. So let's look at this from the possibility standpoint, because this law could effectively kickstart a market for like privacy respecting age assurance, right? So things like on-device facial age estimation that don't store ID, or third-party age tokens that don't reveal identity could be a reality, and also balance the privacy side of that. If you've been listening to me forever, I bloviate about privacy all the time, but that might be the balance that doesn't violate your privacy. Australia itself, the government, has been trialing this technology as well to see if it works. That would balance privacy, like I mentioned. So, this also, for the record, puts us into a stronger bargaining position with big tech worldwide. They have been the 800-pound corporate gorillas in the world. We're seeing a lot of that here in the United States. But over time, this could lead to an international baseline, something akin to, if you operate in democratic markets, here's the minimum you must do for kids. I think those are the pros here potentially of this, but there are cons. There are absolutely cons. And so let's talk about this because this may not necessarily work very well in practice. Kids already routinely lie about their age. I mean, just go look at the UK when they try to enforce age verification laws for adult content websites. Early reports show that some are immediately bypassing bans using VPNs, new devices, foreign app stores, all this kind of stuff. And as age checks get stricter, workarounds basically become more aggressive. They might be sharing an adult account, or they might have underground or foreign apps that don't comply with any kind of safety standards. They could migrate to things like private Discord, encrypted messaging like Signal, fringe sites that are less moderated and that are not on Australia's requirements list, and therefore they basically start to stratify how the teens are using or communicating with each other, and therefore the predators go as well. Longitudinally, I think the worst outcome here is displacement of the issue itself, though. And so think about it this way. The harms don't lessen in this scenario. They just occur less visible, less regulated, because they're going to be less on less regulated platforms, meaning we're still going to have this harm, self-harm, cyberbullying, etc. It's just happening in places we're not seeing. And so that, I think, is a very real possibility here. And then there's the surveillance and privacy creep itself. One of my biggest concerns, because this would be a worldwide issue, to comply, platforms are moving towards age verification, but not just for kids, for everyone, right? Selfie scans, facial age, estimation, know your customer, ID uploads, all these kinds of things. And so civil liberty groups, think like Amnesty International, Cato, EFF, all of them have been arguing prior to this law's passage that this law is an ineffective quick fix that normalizes ID checking for basic online speech and creates massive data security risks. And yeah, I think that's a very valid argument. As a global precedent, that's huge. Think about it this way. Democratic countries could simply adopt broader schemes under the guise of child safety. Right? We're already seeing that exact argument on the fight for encryption backdoors. They want to be able to crack all of our encryption, which basically gives us no privacy for the kids, right? To protect the kids. Authoritarian regimes could also point to Australia and say basically the same thing. We're doing the same thing. We're just raising the age. We're extending this to political content, right? Thus quashing that freedom of speech and expression. They're going to start using all of that infrastructure then to track dissent, as opposed to just protecting children under the guise of, well, we're like the Aussies, right? And then on top of it, there's also the freedom of expression and political participation concerns for the younger generations. We want to get them involved in politics so they start to understand government and civic engagement. The High Court challenge is exactly about this in Australia. So in Australia, there's an implied constitutional freedom of political communication. So if under 16s can't maintain accounts, their ability basically to do things like organize, like climate change strikes, the youth are very much for that, share political views online, participate in civic life online, all of that basically starts to degrade or potentially get killed. That is heavily constrained without the reach of social media, right? So globally, if this model spreads, it's pretty easy to imagine that social media basically becomes an 18 plus with ID space in some jurisdictions. Teenagers are pushed into non-mainstream venues where their political voices cannot be seen or they're harder to be heard. Critics have already pointed out that some of the young people depend on online communities could potentially be harmed. So, and these are the thoughts that I could come up with, as I was reading through all of this. But think about like queer kids in a hostile environment, right? Or neurodivergent or disabled teens whose social life is largely online. If you're stuck in house in a wheelchair or something like that, social media may be your only outlet to really connect with friends. Kids from marginalized groups like religious groups, all that kind of stuff that find support networks via social media as well could potentially be impacted. And then there are the long-term risks. those basically who need, like, the most supportive spaces, maybe cut off from the safest and moderated mainstream platforms. Families with money, right, and that know what they're doing online could help their kids just bypass this and just screw it. There's no consequences to me as a parent, and so I'm just going to let my kid keep doing this because he keeps complaining about it, right? So the issue then becomes poor families, vulnerable families, right? They'll be locked out entirely. They could be using sketchy workarounds that increase risk, because they don't know any better. They don't have any digital literacy. Like, these are things that we have to talk about. And so, depending on the technology adoption, and also the legal adoption worldwide, we could be looking, I think, at three possible scenarios in the next decade or two, depending on how this breaks out. Now, the first scenario is basically, I think, probably the best, most optimal scenario here, but we'll see, right? So age assurance tech evolves into privacy preserving, low friction methods like on-device estimation, cryptographic age tokens, like I mentioned before, data protection regulators like think GDPR, EU, UK, Canada has got a good data protection as well. They start forcing platforms to design age check that doesn't become a de facto global ID system, which is also one of the fears as well. Australia's evaluation basically shows real reductions in specific harms. In other words, in 10 years, we're going to see that there's been a reduction in self-harm, body image issues, all the stuff that Facebook destroyed in a generation and a half. Other countries could stop or start rather adopting narrow evidence-based like delays for social media account for younger teens, and then pair it with education for digital literacy, support for online activities, mental health resources, all of this. If the scenario plays out, the Australian model kind of then right now would be like the seatbelt law from in the United States. Remember that from like the 70s and 80s? You might not have been alive, but you might have read about it. It was controversial. People didn't want to do it at first, but now we just wear seatbelts, and it makes us safer. And seatbelts have proven themselves over the decades to have reduced crashes and harm to people inside vehicles, when they get hit. Now, the next scenario is basically, I think, a lot more pessimistic. ID for everything is the only way that I can really describe it, right? So to avoid liability, Facebooks of the world converge on strong ID verification, store enormous databases, of IDs in our biometrics and face templates, all of that. Other governments raise the minimum age and apply similar requirements to things like forums or gaming sites or messaging sites, gambling, all this kind of stuff. Authoritarian regimes exploit the exact same infrastructure, basically to link real identities to online dissent, citing child safety as a justification. Again, we're already seeing that, in encryption arguments. Under 18s, not 16s, but under 18s online spaces, then either become a lot more sanitized or heavily surveilled, think like walled garden or something like that. Unregulated shadow systems on small or foreign underground services, are basically become the name of the game. And if this is the case, Australia's law then is remembered as the first domino, in that domino effect to just continuously erode, our freedom online, our anonymous speech, all those kinds of things, which directly impact dissidents and the press and everything else. Now, the third scenario is kind of a hybrid. It's a patchwork and kind of circumvention of this. So the courts partially strike down the law or they constrain its reach. So it basically becomes patchy when it comes to enforcement. Kids continue to get social media via VPNs, foreign apps, borrowed accounts, like all the stuff I just talked about. Other countries introduce incompatible age laws. So some countries have 13 plus, some have 16 plus, maybe some have 18 plus, and there are different verification standards all over the place. And then so the platforms, the Facebooks of the world respond by geofencing and splitting features by jurisdiction. So country A gets a whole bunch of stuff because it's more flexible. Country B gets a very limited size of this. Or maybe they start under enforcing this in small markets because nobody cares, or the patchwork of laws allows them to do this, and they're looking for any way to do that, to continue to data mine us, to make money. And so I think the result there is that an internet where the rules depend heavily on which country you appear to be in and how technically savvy you are, basically, and that's where the benefit, basically becomes, right? The actual safety benefit is modest. So I think in the long run, if I'm putting a fine point on this, I'm thinking that given all of the studies and information of the absolute damage that Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, have wrought on an entire generation and a half, I think this is a very novel experiment. And Australia's got, tens of millions of citizens in their population. And so by virtue of that, I think it's a really good test for the world. My concerns are on the privacy side. If we have anonymization, age verification, where it's decentralized and we're not feeding big tech more of our data while maintaining this, I think that's a really good thing. It's always been a fear of mine. I'm very much aligned with things like the Electronic Frontier Foundation on our privacies, regarding these things. That's a huge, huge problem that we'll see. But I think at the end of the day, if they're able to enforce this and if they're able to pull this off, I think that's great. The problem is there are so many gaps and loopholes here in the sense that there's no liability for parents or the kids, which means people are going to find workarounds. Junior's going to be annoyed and complain, and he or she's either going to do it themselves, or the parents are going to throw up their hands and just verify their own account and hand the account over to the kid. So we'll see how this goes, but there's always going to be those that are going to be looking for the VPNs and workarounds. But I also think the vast majority of the population isn't going to do enough about it. And so my fear here is that they're going to move to the Discords, the decentralized locations, and all of this, raise harm. There's no good answer here, but we have to do something. And since nobody's taking my advice and actually just shutting down social media, like I don't think Facebook and Instagram should exist. Mark Zuckerberg should be in jail. Please go look at my other work, literally entitled "It's Time to Put Mark Zuckerberg in Jail," to really get my thoughts on just the horrificness of that man and what he's wrought on the world. We're stuck. And so we'll see what happens. I hope it improves. I really do. I have some optimism there, but realistically, I don't think it's going to change much in the long term. And I hope I'm wrong. We'll see. And I'd love to know what you think too. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 I'm going to say private, online, and secure, and informed. Take care.